Can you hear me? Okay, I want to welcome you all today. I'm Holly Krecka, Executive Director of the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources. Welcome to our speaker series. We have a very special guest today. It is Dr. Mark Northam, the former Executive Director of the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources for 13 years. Yes. And we're really excited to welcome back Dr. Northam. He came to the university after a year and a half with Saudi Aramco in Saudi Arabia, where he worked as a research science consultant in the areas of carbon management and technical intelligence at the Research and Development Center. Prior to joining Saudi Aramco, Mark worked for over 20 years at Mobil and ExxonMobil, holding a variety of research, operations, and management positions in the US and Europe. Mark earned a PhD in organic geochemistry from the University of Texas at Austin and a bachelor degree of science, or a bachelor of science degree in chemistry from Wake Forest University. He retired from the university in 2020 and lives in Norway. So all the way from Norway, please help me in welcoming Dr. Mark Northam.
Thank you, and it's good to be back. Everything you just heard about the introduction doesn't matter anymore because I've dropped the doctor and I go by Captain Northam now since I spend so much time on my boat. When I first started this job, I think after my second presentation, this is working, isn't it? Okay, I can't. After my second presentation, I was getting ready to make a third presentation to the legislature, and President Buchanan leaned over to me just before I stood up to talk and said, "Keep it short, you're never as interesting as you think you are." And it was really good advice, but I have never been able to heed it. So I'll do my best to keep this short. And I want to apologize. I guess I don't need to since I don't see any here anymore, but I didn't wear a tie today. When I retired, I threw all my ties away except for one that I wear to funerals. And this is more of a resurrection than it is a funeral, so I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the green shift, the energy transition in Norway. And one might ask, why Norway? Well, one, I'm living there, and I'm living through it every day. I mean, there is something on the news every day in Norwegian about people's reactions and the things they're doing, but I can tell you it's a very, very important topic in Norway. There's a lot of similarities between Norway and Wyoming in that both entities are very much resource rich, fossil fuels and other minerals. The energy and resource exports are extremely important to government revenue. The exports far exceed internal consumptions. Both have very large sovereign wealth funds, which seem to be untouchable because they're saving the money for future generations. But if both entities don't spend some of that money on the current generation, the future generations aren't really going to benefit as much. Both have small populations in a very large land area. Both have very significant nature-related recreation and tourism. And both have a citizen group that is variously aware of the issues and engaged in discussion of climate change. I don't see any of the normal actors in this room who would start off asking questions after the second slide about why are we even talking about climate change because it isn't real in this room. But every time I gave a presentation in Wyoming, that was a big issue. That doesn't happen as much in Norway, but there are some quite vocal political groups that are anti-climate change activities, and so that's similar to Wyoming. Hang on, I made a couple other notes that I wanted to. I had a lot of time sitting in the airport to think about this. So further to that, energy transition is going to cause economic hardship for both entities, Norway and Wyoming, no matter what. Even if they don't personally participate, the impacts of anti-climate change activities are going to affect them economically. If any country in the world can pull off becoming net zero, it's it's Norway. And I'll tell you why in a few minutes. And significant segments of the population are going to be very anti-energy transition as it starts to materialize, in my opinion. Okay, so just to get on the same page, the green energy transition is the process of shifting away from fossil fuels to renewable energies such as solar, wind, hydroelectric, et cetera. That's what I'm talking about today. There's a lot of people that, there are different definitions, but that's the one I'm using. And I will say that this really isn't anything new. We've been in energy transition since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. When I used to travel with Governor Freudenthal, when he was supporting the School of Energy Resources, he used to start some of his lectures with a story about what it was like to travel during the settling of the western part of this country before fossil energy was transportable, where wagon trains would cross the plains. They could make maybe 20 miles a day. They had to make sure they camped in an area where they had fuel so that they could gather it and cook their meals. And it really hampered the westward expansion. And as you can see at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, Industrial Revolution started 100 years before this slide, but as access to portable fossil energy grew, societal development just went through the roof. So talking about energy transition, we have been in it for hundreds of years, but I believe what we're facing now is much different because it's being driven by something other than access or abundance of energy. It's being driven by the effects of continuing to burn fossil energy, and I believe it's going to be a lot more difficult. But this is what we're facing, and you can see if you look at the consumption curves, they stopped in 2020. At least in Europe, and I think actually worldwide, this war in the Ukraine has really increased the use of coal again. It has caused a big uptick in the production and consumption of oil, and natural gas is just all over the place, literally. Somebody blew up 2 export lines that belonged to the Russians exporting natural gas into Germany, and you would think and there was a significant amount of natural gas that went through those lines. A lot of it went into the atmosphere for a couple of days until they got it all shut down. But that has really spurred others to start producing and exporting natural gas that was otherwise being injected back into fields for pressure support. So I don't have the actual numbers, but I believe that those have really gone up. All right, let me move on. So let me give you, there's a few things of significance that I want to talk about Norway. There's 5.5 million people in Norway, 10 times what we have in Wyoming. Very small population for a very large land area. 204,000 direct and indirect jobs in the oil and gas industry. It's only 7% of the total employment, but the trickle down for manufacturing and transport and other things isn't included in here. Oil and gas production began 50 years ago in Norway. First discovery was in the late 60s. First production was in the early 70s. Oil and gas generates annual taxes and income of over 1 trillion Norwegian kroner, which is it's actually about 140 billion US dollars a year to the state, and then another 37 billion to the counties and municipalities around the country. The oil fund, the sovereign wealth fund, is worth 13 trillion kroner or 1.3 trillion dollars. It's the second largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, behind China's. The difference is most of the money in that is invested internationally. Tax revenue to the fund in 2023 set a record of $84 billion. The fund, as I said, is the world's single largest investor, and it seeks to motivate climate action and otherwise influences social issues. So they use the fund not only as a hedge for the future, but to try to motivate others to lower their carbon footprint. They won't invest in anything that invests in coal, for instance, just as one for instance. Oil and gas production in 22 was 1.5 billion barrels of oil equivalent. They used to be number 2 in the export of oil and gas a while ago. They've dropped, I think, to number 7 now, behind the US actually. 1.2 billion barrels of oil equivalent was exported. So 87% of their production is exported to other countries. I think I can move on. All right, just to orient you a little bit. That coastline from here to here is about 1,100 miles. The early exploration was all down here, and that's where the first production was. But now you've got oil and gas all along the coast and then up in the Barents Sea. The new discoveries are moving out into deeper water up in here. This is the boundary between Norway and England. And so even though there is oil and gas on the other side, it won't be on this map because it doesn't belong to the Norwegians. And then this picture next to it shows you the export pipelines and power lines. So all these red lines are, the export gas. So these red lines are all export to the continent and to the UK. And they're constructing 2 more major pipelines right now to go into Europe. I think I'll get to that later. As I said, production started in the 70s. Whoops. This was really when Ekofisk came online and a number of the early discoveries came in. There was a little bit of gas that was produced in the early days. Most of it was re-injected because there wasn't anything to do with it. They don't use it on shore for much. There wasn't good export routes. There were no pipelines. And you can see normal growth in production type of curve for just about any field in the world. The production has been stable since the late 90s in terms of the overall amount that is produced, but it's becoming, exports of natural gas are becoming a lot more important to the country than oil. I'll talk a little bit about what's going to happen in the future with that as we go along. Just to show you the significance of it. So 55% of the oil and gas oil and gas account for 55% of the global primary energy consumption. 56 of all of that is consumed in the transport sector, and 2% of all of the oil and gas consumed in the world originates in Norway. So while it's not hugely significant on a global scale, it's extremely important in Europe and in the UK, and it's really important to the Norwegians. This is the gas export. So let's see. The EU and the UK consume about 475 billion cubic meters of Norwegian gas. 60% of the gas that has been discovered has not yet been produced, so there's a long future potential for Norway to continue to export gas. 23% of EU's and the UK's gas demand comes from Norway, but those numbers were 2021. That increased dramatically when the Russian gas was excluded from export to Europe for a number of reasons. Sanctions, disruptions in the supply pipelines, which recently was attributed to a pro-Ukrainian, Russians call them terrorist group, the Ukrainians call them patriot group, apparently blew up two major pipelines. And if that it took about a year to attribute those explosions to somebody. There has been a huge, let's say, anxiety over disruption of undersea pipelines, which you saw in that graphic that I showed. There's a lot of them, and so the Europeans and especially the Norwegians have really, let's say, heightened their surveillance to try to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And who knows? I mean, it's a huge area to try to police. And turns out, since this war started, that none of the European countries seem to have as much military presence as they thought, well, as they need, and probably less than their citizens thought they had. Anyway, I'll move on. So one final graphic on the macroeconomic indicators for Norway. Exports of oil and gas are 33% of the GDP of the country, 49% of the state's revenue, 17% share of the total investments that companies make in industry in Norway, and 64% of the total revenue from exports. So it's extremely important to Norway. All right, moving on. Early climate change initiatives. I lived in Norway, moved to Norway in 1993, and I lived there for 5 years. At the time, nobody in the US, except for academics, were even talking about climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, it was just early days for that. But the Norwegians were already listing greenhouse gases as a pollutant and actually doing something about it. They introduced a carbon tax on all combustion of gas, oil, and diesel in the offshore petroleum operations, and on release of CO2 and natural gas into the atmosphere in 1991. Norway has operated the CCUS, the carbon capture it's actually CCS, carbon capture and storage project at the Sleipner field since 1996, storing 1 million tons of CO2 per year, and it has operated uninterrupted since the second try to inject CO2. I was a member of the team that designed that project. We cut some corners on the original injection well. We didn't complete the bottom part of the hole. We started injecting CO2 and the sand collapsed and shut the hole down. So we had to recomplete the well and put in a slotted liner with screens, and started injection about 6 months after the original injection date, and everything has worked mostly fine since. They also changed the name of the Royal Norwegian Ministry of Environment to the Ministry of Climate and Environment in 2014, and there's some reasons for doing that I'll talk about in a little while. So this is the Sleipner project that I worked on, and this is Sleipner West. All of the wells come up into this platform. The natural gas has about 40% CO2 in it, so it comes across this bridge into this facility, which is a gas processing plant, which removes CO2 and compresses it, and it sends the CO2 back this way, and it sends the natural gas down into a pipeline, and of course the flare for when things aren't working correctly. I was on a program I was on a committee for about 8 years to oversee surveillance and do research on this injection, because it was the first large-scale CO2 injection in the world. And we have they started doing 4D seismic in 1999, and they've done it roughly every 2 years since. And so this is the growth of the plume, and you can see that the injection well comes down, and is injected at the bottom of the Utsira Formation. There's a number of clay layers in there that are seals and a very large seal here. So there were a number of things about this that worried us in the beginning. It's a very, very flat formation, so there's very little dip in this formation, but it dips up to the northeast. There are some other facilities tens of miles away to the northeast that they were worried about. If this CO2 moved rapidly, it might impact what's happening in those facilities. Also, they withdraw just tons and tons and tons of water out of the Utsira for formation pressure support and inject it. And so there was potential in the long run of creating flow pathways towards those other injections, and we are seeing some of that. But you can see that, of course, there's no scale on here. Well, there is a 1 kilometer scale right here. You can see that it is actually flowing in the direction that we thought it would, but there are some areas where it is actually being pulled towards, like here, that's being pulled towards where the water is being extracted for pressure support. But basically it's behaving extremely well. There's no evidence of breakthrough of the seals, and it's spreading out, and actually along the edges there is now evidence that it is mineralizing, and that's what we, of course, hope for the long term, is that it mineralizes and stops to move. So it's a project that I'm proud has been extremely successful, and it's now been repeated in Norway, elsewhere. I'll talk about that. All right, so yeah, go ahead.
How many wells are there
For the injection, there's one. So it's all going through one well. The well has been worked over, I think, one time. In all that time, it's behaved extremely well. We were lucky in the design of the second well, in that there hasn't been any issues with it. Keep in mind, it's only 1 million tons a year, but that's all the CO2 that's coming out of that gas. 1 million tons a year is not terribly significant globally, but it's manageable. So that was the important thing. Is there's other stories I can tell you. The carbon tax did not originally cover CO2 emissions into the atmosphere from gas processing, although when we started the project, nobody was aware of that. So the company, Statoil company lawyers, went to the Storting and said, there's a loophole here and we need to have that covered. They did that so that they could get a tax break. They weren't going to pay any taxes, but now they get a big tax break for avoiding it. So, and all future projects that are processing gas offshore have to do something with the CO2 or pay the tax. Okay. I'm going to move on to talking about Norwegian power generation. It's almost entirely renewables-based electricity system. 98% of all the electricity generated in Norway is from renewable sources, and 92% of that is hydro. It's among the lowest electricity generation costs in the world because those hydro plants have been there for a long time, and they continue to invest in efficiency upgrades, but it's their prices are extremely low. Historically, Norway has been a net exporter of electricity in that they export more than they import. There are times when they have to import electricity if the water levels are low, or there's a weather event causes extreme demand, or just like any other power plant, they have to actually shut down some of the hydro plants to do maintenance on them once in a while. The government owns all the infrastructure. The Norwegian people have paid for that through their taxes. All of the transmission lines, everything is owned by the Norwegian people. That's an issue that we'll talk about in a minute. Electricity prices to consumers spiked tenfold in 21-22. So the average price to the consumer was about 7 cents per kilowatt hour of electricity historically, except for a couple of disrupted periods in the past. Starting in the early 2021, just before the Ukrainian war started, energy prices started to spike, and and they just kept going up and up. And everybody was blaming the war, but it actually had nothing to do with the war. They commissioned in late 2020, they commissioned 2 new export cables, one to the UK and one to the EU. And because of that, and the agreements that they made for being able to sell electricity into the European markets, there was some fine print that apparently they didn't read that said that they were obligated to sell electricity in Norway at a price similar to what they were getting selling it into Europe, in order to continue to export the electricity. And they had export contracts into Europe that they couldn't get out of. And so in order to meet those contracts, to get that money and provide electricity to them, they had to raise the prices to the Norwegian people. It's probably one of the biggest political crises that they have had, in my experience, in Norway over the last almost 30 years. On top of that, there was a lower than normal rainfall in the summer of 2021, which was good for my sailing, but really bad for the reservoirs. And a lot of reservoirs almost went dry. And so they were trying to blame it on that, but people kept posting pictures of the other reservoirs that were full to the brim and saying, this is bullshit. You know, you're trying to pull the wool over our eyes. It's caused a huge decline in the popularity of the coalition parties. There's 8 political parties in Norway. They've gone from 42% approval rating down to below 15% now. The next election, if things stay the way they are, they're going to be out of power. They're trying to renegotiate those contracts. The good thing that the war has done is that Europeans need that electricity so bad that they're willing to renegotiate the part about having to charge the Norwegians that amount of money. So it's settling down a little bit. But that is very telling for what's coming as energy transition becomes more intense economically, that as soon as you impact people's pocketbooks, it's going to be politically difficult. This just shows production, consumption, and export, and the darker blues at the top show the renewables. They built the first wind project in Norway, I think, in 1991. At first, the Norwegian people were really receptive, but that has changed. So wind and solar offshore, 64 onshore wind farms in the country. The ones that have been built in the north, first of all, the government owns all the land that they're building it on. So it isn't a question of trying to negotiate with people about, can I build a wind farm on your property? But in some of the areas are culturally sensitive, and some of them actually are the traditional ownership of indigenous populations, and there's a huge social justice issue that has gotten Greta Thunberg's attention going on right now in Norway, where they built a huge wind farm on some land that belonged to the Samis back in the past, and they grazed their reindeer there, and their claims are that the reindeer won't graze under the wind farms. They can't keep them together in the herd, and there's all these problems. Turns out that we're talking about $284,000 in revenue from the sale of reindeer, and the government could very easily make that up. But it's a social justice issue, and they want them to relocate this 64 turbine wind farm up there somewhere else. There are other issues for cities that have a big tourism industry, that have a big wind farm up on the mountain that used to be an overlook of the city and the ocean, where now people are standing under wind farms, and they want those shut down. So this is a growing problem. There's 65 offshore facilities in different stages of planning. 2 of them are actually under development. The protests for both of those 2 are happening all of the time, and so Norwegians in general, according to the surveys, are in favor of wind, but they just don't want any of the projects to be developed. Smaller groups don't want the projects to be developed, and it's something that is similar to what's happening here in the state. Rooftop solar is the only type of solar that they're experiencing right now, but since the tenfold increase in the prices of electricity, they've become very popular. So, in my 30 years of Norway experience, sites like these are becoming much more common. You can see the wind farm. They typically build the wind farms on high areas, which makes sense. They're undeveloped. They're somebody's favorite hiking area. I promise you that at some club or some group has an annual trip that used to go there every year, and now they claim they can't go because of the wind farm, and they make a big, they have a big voice in opposition to that. There tend to be a lot of pensionists who go, retirees who go and stand outside the gate of these with these projects as they're building them with signs saying, you know, you're destroying my favorite area and things like that. There's reason it's retirees is because Norway has an extremely high employment rate, and all the young people, husband, wives, men, women, are employed one way or another and just can't take the time off. But old people got more time than they know what to do with. The red circle on the picture in the upper right, that's the harbor in the town center of Stavanger where I live. Frequently tie my boat up in there as we run in to get some food or something. That red circle is the base of a wind development that is being built offshore right now, and it was headed for deployment when somebody filed some sort of claim that it was going to impact fisheries, and it's been sitting there for about 40 days, maybe 50 days now, because that picture's a little bit old, waiting to decide whether they're going to be able to deploy it. So even in the fields that are being developed, people are taking them to court and trying to stop it. I honestly don't understand. They've had oil and gas production platforms out there for 50 years, and I don't understand the objection to building, because a lot of these wind farms are going very close to where the oil and gas are, but anyway, it's an issue. And then the interesting thing about the rooftop solar, one of the things that the government did in reaction to the high energy prices is they created a zero interest, long-term, 50-year loan for if you wanted to build solar on your roof. A lot of old houses need new roofs in Norway, and they'll allow you to actually pay for the entire roof replacement and the solar cells. And then they offer a grant for homeowners under certain in certain situations that will let's say, make it easier to pay that loan off. So the government is investing in rooftop solar to placate people who are complaining about how much their electric bill is costing them. And we've had 2 of them in my neighborhood just over the winter. Interestingly enough, as soon as the government decided to do that, there are neighborhood associations that have said, no, it changes the look of our neighborhood. And so you have to get your neighbor's permission if they can see your house to build these things. So it's just a different world. I'm sorry. Okay, vehicles. Norway leads the world in the adoption of electric vehicles. They have the highest share of new electric vehicle purchases worldwide. It's currently 80% of all new cars sold in Norway are 100% electric. The Norwegian government established a lot of incentives to encourage the purchase of electric vehicles starting in 1990. And for a long time, I think 2 out of every 3 Teslas being built was sold in Norway. The adoption has been successful enough that the incentives are now being reduced, and disincentives are being created for internal combustion vehicles. I'm not going to read through this picture, but these are the incentives and the timing of the incentives through time to get the Norwegians to buy electric cars. The key benefit for electric vehicle owners remains the green tax deals. So when you buy them, there's no VAT, which is 25% of the cost of the car, and there's no import tax, which is 80% of the cost of the car. When you lease one, you don't have to pay the VAT. When you own one, you don't pay any road tax. You don't pay, you have a reduced company car tax. You don't pay tolls for the roads, which are very significant in Norway. Every road in Norway has a toll on it now. And they have the little license plate readers everywhere, and you have a little box in your windshield that flashes green every time they've charged you another $2-3 to go the next 5 miles down the road. You just can't look at it because if you're an American, because it drives you nuts. The Norwegians don't like it, but they're used to it. And so in the end, electric vehicles are actually, you can buy a Tesla for less than you can pay for a C-Class Mercedes in Norway, and they're far cheaper to operate. That's why there's such a high acceptance of them. And the fuel is cheaper. Our gasoline costs between $8 and $10 a gallon now. It's going to go up because starting next year, they're going to add a CO2 tax to all of the over-the-road and over-the-water fuels. And so even with the high electricity prices, it's a lot cheaper. And the Norwegians are clever. They figured out ways to get their car charged for free. They all carry long extension cords. They rent a cabin in the mountains to go skiing, and you see all of these orange or yellow extension cords coming out of an upstairs window down to their charger to their car. Sometimes the car's 100 meters away, but it's not limited to the citizens. There have been a couple of members of the legislature who've recently been called out for basically running power cords out of their office windows down to the charge of their car during the day. So that's just life, but the fuel is cheaper. Okay, so key points for and against climate action in Norway. Norway is a unitary state giving the government uncontested jurisdictional authority over climate policy. In other words, legislature passes rules, and they don't have to go through negotiation with states or anything else to implement it. It's just one governmental entity. And it's a small, wealthy, socialistic population with a high awareness and concern about climate change that is well ingrained. I mean, it's been taught in the education system now for over 30 years. Those are the positives. The negatives, there's already a very high federal tax burden. About 40 to 50% of everything you earn is taxed by the government when you earn it, and another 25% of everything you spend is taxed by the government. So as energy transition increases the cost of living, there's less to work with, and it's going to be a problem. Norway exports 10 times more emissions than they produce domestically, so if they count those emissions in their reductions, that means the main source of their revenue for supporting their social services like free healthcare, free university, and free education for the kids, and support for single parents, and all of these things is going to become challenging, and they've already passed into law that they cannot use the sovereign wealth fund to replace the downturns in revenue from energy exports. Norway's gas exports have become critical to the EU during this war, and who knows how long that's going to remain. Cutting exports has a huge impact in other countries that Norway supports through its foreign programs. One of the things that happens when you retire is you forget how to say certain words. I can't remember. Anyway, and cutting domestic emissions has very little significance globally. In fact, I'd say zero. And even cutting the emissions from their exports has zero impact globally, and the Norwegians know that. And so they're saying, if this is going to cost us big bucks and change our lifestyle, why should we do it? One thing they've done really smart is they have said they're not going to implement any of these issues or any of these remedies for boats for the foreseeable future, because I think 60% of Norwegians have some sort of boat that burns diesel or gasoline. And they've said until there is a reliable alternative, which is electric engines for their yachts, they're not going to apply the CO2 tax to those fuels. And thank God for that. Okay, I'm going to move now a little bit to what they're doing. This is a refresher for the Paris Agreement, which Norway has signed on to, and I'm not going to read through this, but just to remind you, the Paris Agreement is being implemented through nationally determined commitments. The nationally determined commitments are binding. Norway's nationally determined commitments are to reduce emissions by at least 50% and towards 55% in 2030, based on compared to a base year of 1990. The original goal was 40%. They upgraded it in 2020. The 2050 target is 90 to 95% reduction below the 1990 levels. It's not net zero, but they have an aspiration to become a net zero society. Norway will implement its NDCs jointly with the EU, which allows them to do projects where there's more low-hanging fruit to offset emissions in the country that are going to be hard to eliminate. Smelters and cement plants and things like that. And Norway also provides significant support to projects in other countries which aren't part of the NDCs. The biggest challenge the biggest challenge for achieving the NDCs is historically renewable energy, and it's historically been renewable energy in the stationary sector, so there's no low-hanging fruit to be gained there. Keeping up with growth in electricity demand as all the cars start running off of it, and as industry starts replacing natural gas used in industrial processes with electric furnaces and things like that. They're having a difficulty in keeping up with increasing demand, especially because of the reactions to new wind projects. Replacing revenue loss from declines in oil and gas exports, and I'm not talking about their motivated reductions in exports, but the things that are happening because EU countries that are trying to meet their NDCs will be buying less Norwegian oil and gas. It's a huge concern for them because they're having difficulty finding replacements for those revenue streams. I'm going to move on. Okay, so what is Norway actually doing? You can read that as well as I can. I'm going to move on to the steps. So the number one thing they're doing is using taxation to motivate emissions reductions. I've talked about what they're doing with cars. The carbon tax is going to rise from about $70 a ton for CO2 now to $200 a ton in CO2 emissions. This is for the offshore oil and gas industry by 2030. They're trying to electrify the entire offshore so that they won't have any diesel-operated generators anymore. That's going to be a huge draw from the existing resources, so that's another reason why they need additional capacity. I'll move on. So it's mainly through implementation of carbon taxes on everything. The over-the-road tax is going to increase dramatically as well, and that is going to spur the adoption of electric cars. I would say in another couple of years it's going to be impossible to find an internal combustion engine in a new car in Norway. So the NDCs, not EDCs, nationally determined commitments, are legally binding in Norway. The Storting passed the Climate Act, which became effective in January of 2018, that says they must meet their commitments. It commits Norway to cooperate with the EU in climate legislation, so as the EU strengthens their actions against emissions, Norway must act in concert with them. But they have access to the emissions trading scheme, which is actually working in the EU pretty well. And it states an intention to exceed the NDCs. I don't know why I switched to EDC, but Norway is capturing and storing CO2. Sleipner and the Snøhvit field, which is way in the north that I showed you on the map, those are already operating. They have implemented a project called Longship and Northern Lights, where basically they have two projects in the Oslo Fjord where they're capturing CO2 up to 80% of the emissions from a cement plant and another from a waste to energy plant, compressing the CO2 on the site, transporting it to the west coast of Norway to Mongstad, where it's stored onshore temporarily. They're drilling injection wells so that it will be injected into the offshore for permanent storage. Longship is the project for the capture side, and Northern Lights is the project for the transport and injection. That project is supposed to be up and running in 2024. I'm a member of the advisory committee for the injection site. They invited a bunch of us old guys who worked on Sleipner to come in and tell stories about what you can do wrong, and because that's what happens most of the time. But it is actually a very important project, and I enjoy being engaged in it. The fourth thing, they're decarbonizing the transportation. I've already talked about that, mainly through the incentives for electric cars. 80% of the sales, new car sales, is for electric cars, as I've already said, but it's only achieved since 1990, when they started incentivizing. It's only achieved 20% fleet penetration. So there's a long way to go. There's a lot of old gasoline cars on the road as well. Fossil fuel cars are going to be, they're subject to higher registration tax now, and a CO2 tax, and a higher road tax, road use tax on the fuels. There's a lot of talk, and they've signaled that they may ban all future sales of internal combustion engines for automobiles in 2025. They're electrifying ferries, trains, and buses, and there are a lot of them in Norway. This is really significant because every city has got full bus service. There's a lot of ferries that are required to move around the state because you have to, the country, because you have to cross fjords and to get anywhere. So that's significant. There's a claim that they'll have zero emissions aviation, commercial aviation domestically in 2026. And the Prime Minister has stated that he will be a passenger on the first electric-powered commercial flight in Norway. I think he's got an out in that it's very unlikely he'll be reelected, and that happens before 2026. So, but they're serious about it, and they're actually they've got some prototype airplanes that are being tested now. And there's a lot of support for R&D of use of ammonia and hydrogen as maritime fuels. Maritime ships are very difficult to do anything about unless you change the fuel system. You can't capture it. And electric, there's one electric tanker that transports refined products from one side of Oslo Fjord to the other, and it can only run in each direction once every 3 days because that's how long it takes to recharge the batteries. But I'm sure there'll be big improvements in the offshore as well. Okay, so reducing emissions in oil and gas production. The goal is a 40% reduction, which is 5.4 million tons of CO2 equivalent in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 compared with 2005. And further decline to near zero by 2050. Carbon capture and storage for all gas processing units offshore. They're going to electrify the facilities, as I said. Phase out of fields where these measures are not feasible. But it's going to be very difficult for them to do that because of the contracts they have with the people who own the licenses. Even though Statoil or now a different name, Equinor is a partner in every field, as is the government. The government owns between 25 and 50% of every license They're a partner at 25 to 50% of every license in the offshore. Reducing production and discontinuing the award of new leases is under discussion. Every time they get close, it tends to fall off the table. But they may get there. Okay, so is Norway on track? I'm almost done. The answer is no, but there's a strong commitment to achieve the NDCs. The war in Ukraine has significantly raised Norway's energy exports to Europe for humanitarian reasons. Electricity prices are at record highs, and people are still rejecting new wind projects and other methods. They want Norway to renegotiate the contracts. I really believe if they can get the electricity prices down, they will actually be more receptive to new wind. But there's a belief that the government is building new wind projects to support export and not internal consumption. The big issue is the revenue replacement from oil and gas. They're just not finding things that will take the place of it. There's a lot of talk about future export of hydrogen, replacing the revenue, but it isn't going to come close. No matter how good it is, it won't come close to replacing it. So that's a concern, but there's a lot of activity in trying to find it. I honestly believe they're going to get back on track. Are there lessons to be learned for Wyoming? Not much that you don't already know, and I'm not going to go through these because you're already doing it. The one thing I think that you really need to stay aware of is public opinion can derail anything that the state tries to do, and the revenue streams have to be replaced, because as soon as the budgets get a little bit tight because you're not making as much off of the energy export revenues, then people start talking about reduction of social programs and education and other things. They don't talk about fat in government. I mean, here they do in Wyoming, but they go to the emotional issues first, and that tends to derail the people's sentiment about forging ahead with these projects. So keep up the outreach program and continue to look for ways to turn coal into valuable products and generate hydrogen, and because you need that revenue, whether it makes sense on an environmental issue or not. If you don't replace that revenue, you're not going to get anywhere with the other things. That's my opinion from years of experience in dealing with this. So, final words. My only advice, based on my experience over the last 3 years, is use sunscreen, especially when you're young. And then I wanted to leave you with, these are my efforts in the area of wind power. My wife and I bought that boat that you can see in the lower left, and we've cruised over 1,000 nautical miles in the last 2 years. We sold that boat over the winter, and we bought one that's bigger. My grandfather used to always say, as soon as you get a boat, you need one that's 2 feet longer. Well, we got one that's 7 feet longer, and because I'm not going to live long enough to go through the 2 feet to get there. So anyway, we're doing our part, and I'll stop here and ask if there are any questions or anybody wants to make comments.
Thanks so much, Mark. That was wonderful. A lot to be learned. And are you able to stick around for a minute? Maybe we can have. Okay. So if you have questions. Okay, wonderful. He'll stick around for a little bit if you have any questions. So please come talk to Mark, and join me again in thanking Mark for coming all the way from Norway to give this presentation. So, yeah, it was great. Thank you so much. Here you go. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.